My grandfather was drunk and my father was drunk, but I never touched a drop. There is a reason for that. When I was young, times were hard and I grew up poor. My grandfather and my father never did an honest day's work in their lives. Granddad wasn't good for much, but he played the clarinet like an artist. Taught my father how to play the accordion. Every Christmas they would gather a group of their friends and go from door to door playing Christmas music, singing Christmas carols and begging for money. Afterwards they would all go to the club and spend it on alcohol. On a Christmas Eve they brought me with them. I was too young to play an instrument, so they handed me a triangle and told me to strike it every now and then. The night was dark, the snow was falling, and the cold December wind cut through us like a knife. We kept our heads down and struggled through the snow and the sleet. Eventually, my grandfather stopped and said, "This looks like as good a place as any." We were outside a big mansion, decorated with Christmas lights. My grandfather knocked on the door. We began to play some old Christmas cards. The door of the house swung up, and in the dim light I saw a young woman standing there. She was holding a tray of glass in her hands. With a smile, she picked up a glass and held it out, inviting one of the men to drink. My grandfather rubbed his hand together with a glee and took the glass. Just then, I looked up, and in the wind above, I saw a face peering out the shadow. A face that was hideous beyond words. I looked back at the woman in the doorway, and her face was hideous too. Before I could stop him, my grandfather put the glass to his lips and knocked it back with one big gulp. "Oh dear," said the woman in a nearly childish voice, "you've drunk blood, sir." With that, the door slammed shut. Grandfather stumbled backwards, and the glass fell from his hands. It shattered with a deafening crash, and he collapsed in the snow. I don't remember much after that. All I recall is waking up in the light of dawn and finding myself lying in the snow. The other men were lying all around me, just waking up themselves. My grandfather got to his feet and rubbed his head. The woman has disappeared, and the house was boarded up and abandoned. All that was left was a dark red stain in the snow where the glass had broken. My grandfather lay there in the snow beside his eyes, all purple and swollen. He was as dead as a doornail. We hurried home that morning and called the police. They picked up my grandfather's body and brought it to the mortuary. My father told them what had happened, but they didn't believe a word of his tale. They said the house had been vacant for over 100 years. After that night, my father was never the same man again. He never let another drop of alcohol touch his lips and made sure I did the same. There was a married couple who had 3 daughters. The oldest was 15, the middle was 12, and the youngest was 7 years old. For Christmas, the oldest daughter asked for a laptop. The middle daughter asked for an iPad, and the youngest daughter asked for a small doll. On Christmas Day, they all unwrapped their presents beneath the Christmas tree. The oldest and the middle daughter received what they had asked for, but the youngest daughter was surprised to receive a clown puppet. However, the clown puppet was so cute that she decided to keep it. 2 days later, the youngest girl disappeared. The next Christmas, the youngest daughter asked for an iPad and the middle daughter asked for a clown puppet in memory of her little sister. 2 days later, the middle daughter disappeared. And the next Christmas, the last remaining daughter asked for a clown puppy in memory of her 2 young sisters. 2 days later, she too disappeared. The parents became very poor and were forced to sell their furniture for money. One day, they went into an attic looking for something else they could sell. There, in the dark rest, they saw the clown puppet. It was sitting in a throne made from lollipop sticks arranged all around it were the severed heads of the 3 missing girls. This story, guys, maybe looks so creepy, but this happened in real life. When selling a house, if a death occurred within 3 years of the house marked on the market, the seller is required to inform potential buyers of said death. This little requirement wasn't necessary in my case. Everyone within a 15-mile radio seemed to know about Victoria Taylor. It was a tragic story. She had given birth to a bouncing baby boy whose father no one seemed to know. The baby passed away just a few months later, and Victoria took her own life a year after that. That much was known to be true. What was unknown were circumstances surrounding the answer. How the baby died. Some said accident, some said illness, some said murder, how Victoria killed herself, and what happened in between. The popular rumor was that Victoria, in her grief-stricken psychosis, began buying dolls to replace her deadly depression. The doll would then suffer the same fate as the real baby in her mind, and she would bury it and move on to another. People, mostly teenagers, made it a Halloween tradition to search for the doll graveyard. They searched the backyard and the woods behind it, but nothing was found. In the 6 years that house was in, was confident that the house that I bought for my family and me had nothing strange in its history, but too tragic. The first few months living in the Taylor house were uneventful. I had to occasionally show a curious local that weren't aware that our house was no longer empty. I found no ghosts or satanic symbols or anything of the like. It seemed that it was just a house. On that, I got a huge discount on because of what happened there and the bad juju it was rumored to have acquired because of it. By the time the Christmas season rolled around, I had pretty much forgotten about Victoria. That my son Caleb was really aware of anything other than presents. We lined the roof and the windows with light, hung a wreath on the door, and put some standing decoration on the lawn. We bought and decorated the tree big enough to fit a toy store underneath, which was appreciated because of how many presents Santa was going to bring Caleb that year. He was getting more excited each day, especially since he had been dropping some pretty big hints that he was getting a pup. My family was the happiest it had ever been until a week before Christmas. My wife had been wrapping presents as we bought them, so we didn't have to stay up all the night on Christmas like we had in the previous years. She had opened the door to the closest that held the presents to find the wrapping paper torn to shreds. He first thought it was that Caleb had gotten into them, but I doubted that he would be able to contain his excitement if he did. It looked almost as if some sort of rodent had shredded the paper. The boxes were damaged at all. We brushed it off as a mystery and moved present to the attic. After wrapping them, I occasionally heard some shuffling from inside that closet, but I never saw whatever creature had caused it. I figured I would call an exterminator after Christmas to check inside the walls. Soon things started to get really strange. I walked into the room to find the dirty clothes scattered around the room and the hamper on its inside. My wife found the refrigerator door hanging open, with food torn up and thrown on the floor. Caleb was distraught one morning when he woke up to find all the toys that he had carefully placed in his toys box the night before had been thrown all around his room while he slept. All this and the noises in the walls were getting more frequent and were heard everywhere in the house. My superstitious mother was becoming scared that the local urban legend was true, that Victoria Taylor still haunted the house. She reasoned that the spirit was becoming more active because we were so happily preparing for the holidays with our son, something she never got to do. I laughed at her theory. I shouldn't have Christmas, my wife, and I put Caleb to bed. We had to return to his room several times to tell him that if he didn't go to sleep, Santa wouldn't bring him anything. When I was convinced that he was going finally to stay in his bedroom, I picked the puppy up from my mother's house and brought it home. We hadn't named him yet, but he was a golden retriever puppy that was as energetic as he has soft and fluffy. After playing with him for a while, we put him to bed in his crate, ate the cookies Caleb left for Santa, and turned it in for the night. I was jerked from my slumber by blood curdling my scream. My wife and I followed our son's cries for help to the living room. Caleb had snuck out of bed and found the pup. Instead of the happy fluff ball that we had left by the tree, he found a mangled metal crate filled and surrounded by blood and chunks of discarded meet. My wife took Caleb into another room to console him, while I checked for intruders and signs of break-in. I found nothing, so I returned to the living room and began cleaning up the mess. I was kneeling on the floor, convincing myself that there was a silver lining in the fact that we had hardwood floor instead of carpet. When I heard a tinkling noise come from the tree, I turned my head just in time to see a pair of big blue eyes staring at me from the branches. I jumped to my feet and backed up a few paces just as the first doll dropped from the tree. It was followed by 3 others. They were those delicate porcelain dolls, wearing what were probably pretty little dresses at one time. I couldn't tell because the dresses were covered in dirt and blood. I watched with a mixture of terror and disbelief as all 4 dolls slowly rose from the ground and started toward me. The screams of my wife and son snapped out and horrified my trains. The dolls' heads turned as I ran from the room to find my family. I raced up the stairs to my room, where I found my wife standing in our bed with Caleb in her arms. Dozens, varying in states of damage and fear, were standing on the floor surrounding the bed. They were making their way toward my loved ones with their tiny arms stretched out, reaching for the woman and child who were desperately trying to stay away. I started kicking the little diamonds out of the way as I hurried to the rescue of my wife and my child. I didn't think a bunch of dolls would be so hard to push through, but I was so strong. For everyone that I kicked away, 4 more came out at me. They grabbed and pulled and thrashed and by, and I found myself moving away from the bed instead of toward. After noticing that most of the dolls had directed their attention to me, I yelled for my wife to run. I hoped that I severed as enough of discretion for the diamond doll that her and Carl could get away unharmed. Dolls were still trying to reach them, were lining to the sides of the bed, climbing with delicate little hands. My wife jumped off the bed, stumbled and fell. Caleb's head hit the floor, and the resulting cries caught the attention of many of the dolls. I was desperately trying to fight off and keep away. My wife tried to right herself and gather our son before the waves of small monsters got to them, but she was too slow. I watched as the dolls quickly swarmed Caleb and began tearing at his flesh. My wife started trying to get them away, but I turned on her. But Caleb stopped thrashing and made my way to them just as my wife stopped fighting. I saw the despair in her eyes as a doll with black hair and a grey tattered dress bit a shank for her throat. The creatures moved. There were so many of them, we didn't stand a chance. I don't know how long I stood in my bedroom, watching a board of dolls ripping apart the 2 people I loved the most in the world before I realized that I was no longer being attacked. Every porcelain creature was crawling around and was left of my wife and my son, feasting on them. I regret what I did next every day since. I ran. I bounded down the steps as fast as my feet would carry me. I reached the front door when I heard the woman's voice came from the second floor. "That's right, my children. Feel those bellies, so you can grow big and strong." I shut the door behind me and fell down the steps of the front porch after vomiting up the cookies I had eaten earlier that night. I turned to look at the house. Peeking out the window, illuminated by the colorful Christmas light, was a gaunt woman wearing a tattered dress. She smiled through a veil of stringy hair as the doll climbed up the front of her dress and into her arms, then closed the suture.